Yes, okay, success. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Today, it's my privilege and pleasure to host Hosam Arab, who was one of the more difficult guests to get on the MAGNiTT webinar. Today, we're talking about e-commerce startups and tools for survival and how we can build robust e-commerce startups that can scale and thrive and survive COVID-19. And so we're hosting Hosam. Hosam, for those of you who don't know, previously co-founded and managed Namshi for about 8 years before exiting to join and co-found Tabby, his current startup. And so we thought he would be the best man to talk about e-commerce. But I will let Hosam tell you a little bit more about his background. Welcome, Hosam.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
All right, great. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks Noor for having me on. So yeah, maybe just a quick brief on my background and how I got into this. So honestly, primarily by luck and by default, I fell into entrepreneurship and e-commerce. Right. So early on, I studied engineering, went into engineering school, did a degree in electrical engineering, and then joined Schlumberger in oil and gas. So did some oil and gas for a couple of years, and then went into water treatment, and not exactly the natural transition from there to fashion e-commerce, but I'll explain how that happened. So after a couple of years of doing that, I decided that I wanted a more, I guess, humane and just a job that would put me in a decent place rather than traveling from one place to another all the time. So decided that I was done with engineering and went and did my MBA. Came back, did a little bit of private equity and some advisory work. So honestly, just throughout my career, didn't really enjoy anything that I did, right? And it was very clear to me that after a few months to a year within any job, things were not working out, and after trying basically every industry that there was out there, so I did private equity, I did finance, I did advisory, and engineering. So the one thing that I didn't do is medicine. I decided that maybe the problem was not the industries themselves, but maybe it was me, and so decided to try entrepreneurship out, and honestly, things kind of fell into place on their own. So I quit my job in Abu Dhabi, moved to Dubai. Had just had my first child, so the timing was perfect, and decided to take probably what was the biggest risk of my life at that point in time, and start Namshi. So got together with my co-founders at the time, and we got out to build fashion e-commerce for the region. And I think if we look back at what the industry looked like at the time and what the ecosystem looked like at the time, there were a few players. I think Souk, Marca VIP, and a few others here and there.
This was about 10 years ago, right?
So this was 2011. Yes, exactly. So there were a few players in the UAE, not much going on in Saudi, and so I think the opportunity was right, and I think when we went and spoke to potential suppliers and investors and things like that, the question, I guess, primarily from suppliers that we got is, fine, e-commerce is great in other markets, but why would anyone shop online in Dubai? People love going to the malls in Dubai. And also, I think our view at that point was the consumer in this market is no different from the consumer in other markets. They value convenience, they value variety, they value a great experience, and I think thankfully we were proven right. So people, it did take some time. We did have to obviously educate the market and do a lot of mistakes. So I think we were quite lucky in the sense that there wasn't much competition specifically in our sector. So we had the luxury of time. We had the luxury of being able to make a lot of mistakes and learn as we went. And obviously, we had the luxury of not having to overspend on many things that
Right.
I see a lot of businesses do these days, right? So I think things kind of fell into place, and we, for one reason or another, we ended up succeeding.
Right. And so you built Namshi, and then you kind of turned your attention to another startup in the e-commerce space. So tell us a little bit about what your takeaways from building Namshi were and what you bring into Tabby. Because Tabby is a little bit different, right?
Yeah, so very different. I mean, so, you know, from pure play e-commerce where we were buying and selling goods, right now we've moved into FinTech. I think one of the reasons we wanted to look at FinTech and specifically buy now, pay later as a solution for the region is just one of the areas that was clearly broken when we were building Namshi and throughout was the payments piece and the payments infrastructure in the region, where, you know, up until today and the time that I left Namshi, about 70% of our orders were cash on delivery, and that's just not something that's sustainable, and it really was an obstacle to allowing e-commerce to flourish in the region. And I think, you know, for a lot of startups these days where they don't have sufficient funding, or even if you do have the funding, the working capital just is not conducive to allowing a company to scale when, you know, you buy a product, pay the supplier, ship it, and wait 20 days and then get your money in. It's completely the other way around from how e-commerce happens in other parts of the world. And so that's a problem we identified and something that we wanted to solve for, and that's what we're trying to do right now. So you know, Tabby is providing a alternative to COD, and we will talk about that a bit later.
Right. So obviously, talking about e-commerce now is almost like talking about shops, because e-commerce can be luxury, it can be fashion, it can be grocery, it can be home goods, it can be almost anything, right? So it's obviously, it's a broad industry that is a little bit expansive. And what we've seen at MAGNiTT in terms of the research and the data is that the industries that have typically raised the most amount of money are the ones in fashion, grocery, I think general as well as another category. So could you please give us just like an overview so that we can have a working framework of understanding what we mean when we say e-commerce in the region?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's basically buying and selling of goods and delivering them to a client, right, to a customer. I think that's a broad definition, the way we see it. And so, yes, you have multiple players on this, and you have companies across the region doing different things. I think the one area that we saw substantial competition in was fashion e-commerce. In about probably about year 4 or 5 of Namshi, we started seeing that as probably a very overcrowded market. And the example here is, if you look at the GCC, and probably more specifically the UAE, you know, an economy the size of London has in terms of population, has about 7 or 8 fashion e-commerce players, mostly doing the same thing. Whereas, you know, you have ASOS covering the entire of the UK, and, you know, 2 players, ASOS and Zalando, covering pretty much the entire of Europe and other parts of the world. So I think, you know, one of the things that we saw in the region is there is a lot of repetition that is happening. And I think, you know, when people think e-commerce, people think that I need to have a website and I can get some product online and all of a sudden it starts selling. And it's really a complex problem to solve and a complex business to scale. And then to scale profitably becomes even more difficult. Right? And yeah.
No. So I was going to say, obviously, COVID-19 means that more and more of us are having to transact online, which presents an interesting opportunity, not just in the UAE, but in other markets that have been maybe slower to catch up. For example, Egypt, we're expecting to see more adoption of these sort of technologies that facilitate us staying at home. So we're going to see a lot of brick and mortar now looking to move online. Is it too late for these guys? Have they missed the boat? the e-commerce?
No, I mean, absolutely. They're definitely not too late. And I think if COVID-19 has showed anything, is that we need to have more commerce happening online, and these guys need to be online, right? If you look at many of the big groups in the region, I think they've been caught off guard by what has happened. And yes, while many of them had digitization plans and they wanted to go online over the next 2-3 years, I mean, this has really sped things up. I think the real question is how do you go online, right? Does it mean that you need to go and set up your own website and buy your own inventory and then set up your own last mile and do all that, or is there more collaboration that can happen, and can you reuse a lot of what's out there? And I think I would argue that it should be the latter. I think the historically what has happened in this region is we've had big groups with exclusivity agreements for certain brands and certain ways of doing things, and everyone felt that it was necessary to build and do their own thing. So everyone has their own mall and everyone has their own set of brands. I think that may have worked back then, but I just don't think that that's transferable to online, right? We don't need to have another 6 or 7 Namshis, and we don't need to have another 10 marketplaces. And so I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration. So the question on, do I go online? I think, yes, you absolutely go online, but how do you do that is much more important. And if there are players that exist that can help you do certain things, then I think people just need to be a lot more open to collaborating in these ways.
That's a very interesting point. So let me ask you, obviously the challenges that some startups in the region face are often consistently unique, but I think there's a unique set of challenges for e-commerce startups. What if you're thinking of starting up an e-commerce platform today, right? Mm-hmm. What are the challenges that you should be aware of?
Sure. So I think there's a few things, right? There's funding is one of the mm-hmm. big things that you just need to solve, but that's regardless of industry, that's regardless of what you're in. But I specifically call it funding because it determines what kind of business model you want to pursue when you are building e-commerce. Do you want to own your inventory, or do you want to use existing inventory and set up a marketplace, right? Do you want to build your own last mile, or do you want to use what exists out there, right? And maybe in other markets, using a third party is a given, and right. And if you look at more developed markets where third party logistics works and works well, specifically on the e-commerce side, then that's one less headache you need to worry about. And you rarely ever hear of businesses building their own last mile in more mature markets. I think the challenge in this market is we've been forced to, and if I look back at Tabby, at Namshi 10 years ago. We used what was out there. We used the existing infrastructure, and it was very clearly broken, and the experience was subpar. So we kind of were forced to build our own last mile. I think part of that is a cost consideration, but I think the much bigger consideration there was just the experience was lacking. And while I think we've moved leaps and bounds in that regard over the last few years, I still don't think that we're at where other parts of the world are on logistics. And I think that's more compounded by the fact that this market is dependent on COD, right? So you end up only being restricted to a couple of players that offer that service, and unfortunately, these players are, they're not getting things right yet, right? That's they've been doing this for about 10, 15 years, and yet you hear people still talking about setting up their own logistics infrastructure, which is just, it's mind-boggling that this still needs to happen.
So okay,
right. So I address logistics. Maybe the other part on experience is inventory, right? And the reason why you choose between owning your own inventory or not, again, for me, is related to experience. When you were thinking about that for Namshi, obviously it's a very expensive undertaking to sit there and buy all your inventory and take risk on that. But on the other hand, the the experience lacks considerably when you're working with suppliers that might not be able to suit your demand, and also not always be able to fulfill when and if you need that, right? So we still see, right? I think if you have large pull and large power, like a MENA or an Amazon, you can control that experience with your marketplace suppliers fairly easily. But if you're a smaller player, you just fall down the list of priorities for many of these suppliers, and essentially you end up just losing out on the experience because these guys can't fulfill your orders. So when thinking about it, I think the key question I ask myself is what is the experience that you would get out of building versus using what's out there, and unless you can manage and control that experience, unfortunately, the alternative is having to put up a lot of capital.
Okay, so here's another question, kind of brought about by what you just said. In terms of cash on demand for e-commerce purchases in the region, are we still seeing a majority that are cash on demand, do you think?
So, the experience that I had at Namshi and the experience that we're seeing today from all the discussions we're having with all the our partner merchants, Tabby, is yes, both in the UAE and Saudi. I think UAE is only slightly better, at around 50%, 40% in some cases, and I think that's specifically on goods e-commerce, right? Maybe when you're talking about things like travel and services and things like that, that's very different. But specifically when we're talking about goods and products, then those rates are actually quite high. And now, one benefit, again, another silver lining of COVID-19, is that we are starting to see a forced shift away from from COD, right? So in Saudi Arabia, the authorities kind of switched off or asked e-commerce companies to switch off COD. I think a lot of companies took it upon themselves, which is, I think, the right thing to do as well, and switch it off. I think if we look back at where we were 5 to 8 years ago, you just didn't want to be the first company to do that. And now maybe that many have started to switch off COD. Maybe this is a good opportunity for people to try it out and see how the customer reacts. I think now is as good a time as any to do that.
So I think that you face the reality of my next question, and so are in a great position to answer it. As a regional e-commerce player in whatever industry, how do I protect myself against potentially big international heavyweights like ASOS that are coming in to do exactly what I do? How do I build that moat?
Sure. So I think there is some things that you can protect against and others that you can't, right? So when we looked at our experience, and maybe two good examples at Namshi is we looked at ASOS and we looked at Jolly Chic, right? Two good examples there, both very well-funded, large behemoths of e-commerce players. ASOS, and what we could do better and consistently do better was experience, right? In terms of just delivering to the customer. Yes, so delivering the customer as quickly as possible, understanding the local needs of the customers, communicating with them in their own languages, providing them with local payment methods like COD, returns, refunds, all these things I think were areas in which we could differentiate. And I think that's one thing that local players can always differentiate from the international competition with. Obviously, that's becoming less and less protectable over time, but there's still many things that you can do. But with say Jolly Chic, so we could definitely beat them on the experience. Where we couldn't beat them was on price. Yeah. Right, and we got to a point where you have Chinese supply coming in and flooding the market, and we had to compete in probably a losing battle, right? So it was a decision that we had to make at that point in time. Do we try to compete with these guys, or do we just continue to do what we're doing and try to differentiate on the other benefits and aspects of what Namshi did? So yeah, I think choose your battles. Understand what are your strengths and what are the areas that you can actually win in, and some areas honestly it's just quite difficult. Now the way I look at it as well is what is a sustainable model for the consumers in this part of the world, right? So if you burn prices and you continue to sell at
a loss.
At a loss, or maybe for a lot of Chinese players, they weren't selling at a loss because their cost of goods is quite low. But the customer at the end of the day values experience. And yes, I might buy from you once or twice, but if the quality of the product is not where it needs to be, I'm probably not going to buy from you.
I'm not going to come back, right?
Right. And so I think you look back at some of these some of the Chinese players, and I think they're starting to have challenges in that regard, where the customer is becoming a lot more aware and informed on what they want in terms of quality.
Okay, so Hosam, obviously we touched a little bit briefly on fundraising, and I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper there. So if you're an early stage e-commerce startup, right, that's thinking about fundraising at this current time, bearing in mind things like potentially fragmented markets, and it's difficult to find the defensibility of the startup in and of itself, what is the outlook? Are we expecting to find e-commerce startups finding difficulty raising, hits in valuations? What's your take on that as an entrepreneur?
Sure. I mean, as I'm not a fortune teller here, I think what we see today from just discussions that we're having with various VCs and startups in the region is, yes, funding is drying up. I think a lot of LPs are recoiling and just holding money back until the situation clears up, or if it clears up. We see oil prices today at $11. I'm not sure if we have a very great outlook coming up. So I think things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. So I wish I had an alternative view on this. And so the VCs that we're talking to are saying, if you are a startup, make sure that you have 18 to 24 months of runway with you, which might not be easy. But in order to do that, I think there's two things you can do: either raise more money, and then we go back to the same problem where that's becoming a bit more challenging, or just save the funding that you have right now and just focus on priorities and ensure that you're cost cutting. If you have the funding, then double down and try to see what you can make out of the current situation. But yeah, it is definitely a challenging time, and it doesn't look like it's getting any better anytime soon.
Okay, so coming back to fragmentation of the market, right? We've been seeing a lot of VCs and some entrepreneurs calling for consolidation. So startups to potentially merge or acquire each other in order to create synergies and help them, become a little bit more robust and able to deal with the challenges that may come. How would you go about thinking about that? Where would you start considering that?
So I think it's similar to the point I mentioned earlier. I think people need to be a lot more open to working together. And I think now is the time, right? As funding starts to dry up, as people have less money in their bank accounts to spend, it's only going to get more and more challenging. So, with that, so you have less money to spend. People are going to start. Everyone's bought inventory for their e-commerce business. There's not many ways in which you can sell this inventory unless you discount it. And everyone ends up burning money. So I think now is as good a time as any to consolidate and look at what people can do together. Again, do we need to have 7 or 8 namshis in this part of the world? Not 5 years ago, and definitely not now. If there are ways in which groups can start looking at coming together, I think they definitely need to explore it. And look at complements as well. So if there is a great startup doing last mile logistics, and you're in an area of you're doing e-commerce, try to see what you can do with them rather than deciding to build your own another last mile service in the region.
And this is a difficult question for a lot of people, but we also know that some industries, even within e-commerce, have been impacted very negatively, right? Either things have been held up at borders, or the whole category, like luxury, for example, has been a little bit challenged. Obviously, everybody is facing challenges as a result of everything that's happening with COVID-19. But when do you think it's time to know to pull the plug, right?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I've seen a number of businesses that kind of continue to go at it for some time, and I think yes, that fight is nice for some time, but you know, there needs to be a time when someone just there is going to be writing on the wall, and you take count of that, and maybe something's not working, maybe the product doesn't fit the market, and so if I've been trying to do the same thing for 2 or 3 years and I still can't scale it, maybe there's something wrong there, and you know, I need to change my business model or just look at something completely different. If I still haven't been able to scale efficiently after 4 or 5 years as well, and I'm not saying profitability, right? Profitability is great, and I definitely, obviously, we need to see more companies striving towards that. But I think it's a path towards profitability. And if I haven't seen a path towards profitability after going at it for 4 or 5 years, then
you might not be able to.
Yeah.
And if you were gonna give yourself one piece of advice, Hosam, as an entrepreneur, fictional entrepreneur starting a business today, what advice would that be?
And if I'm giving advice to myself post Namshi, I think take some time off. I think that's probably one thing I should have done after my previous business, and just take some time off, take a breather, and reevaluate things. Obviously, I jumped into the deep end right again, and so no regrets, but it would have been nice.
And for another entrepreneur, for somebody who's thinking today, I have an e-commerce startup that I would like to kick off, what advice would you give them?
Listen, I think it's important to understand the dynamics of the market today, and there is a market reality, and brute force in many cases is not going to work, right? If something does not fit, and if the market is not demanding it, then maybe wait and maybe look at something else. But we've seen now, obviously, that food delivery and supermarket delivery is doing well. But again, do we need to have 20 food delivery services and restaurants and supermarket delivery services in the UAE? I would probably say no, right? Because what happens at some point is you just have, and I think we've already seen it in a number of industries, there's just massive oversupply, and the only way to scale your business is through discounting and burning prices, and then everyone's a loser.
And nobody wins, right?
Nobody wins, right? So I think, ask yourself, am I really solving a problem that nobody else, and not necessarily nobody else, but can I solve it in a different way? Can I differentiate from what is out there? And if not, ask yourself, is the market satisfied right now with what's out there? Nothing against copycats, right? We had a supposed copycat with Namshi, but I think a copycat of a copycat of a copycat is probably not
one level too many.
It's probably one level too many. Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm going to give over to the audience because we've gotten about 20 questions so far that we need to cover in the next 15 minutes. So unfortunately, we won't be able to answer all of the questions.
Sure.
So I'll just be sharing them with you, Hosam. To kick things off, what industries in e-commerce do you think will flourish post this pandemic, and which will have a longer period of time to recover?
Right, so I think what's been clear right now is non-discretionary spending non-discretionary spending is what is going to survive through this pandemic, and what it looks like is it's going to continue to be the case for some time. Right, so any areas where you don't see substantial shifts in consumer demand in the short to medium term are probably areas that should receive some interest. Right, so e-commerce, I think the space is fairly limited at the moment in terms of verticals. What is going to come back probably once things come back to normal slightly is there will be an uptick in spending. How long that's going to be the case for, that's anyone's guess. I would guess that it's not going to be very long, given that as we've seen, people are losing their jobs. There's been cuts on salaries, so savings are just going to be hit significantly. So I would focus on non-discretionary in the short to medium term, and I can't see that shifting probably for the next year or so.
So here's a question that I actually really want the answer to, and that I know we at MAGNiTT have been discussing extensively. Do you think that COVID will shift e-commerce shopping behavior within MENA? Or do you think that after all this blows over, mall culture will still be around? And also, this is kind of a question about, we're seeing this surge in consumer adoption of these different verticals. Will we still be seeing that when COVID-19 blows over and we go back to whatever the new normal looks like, do you think?
Yeah, I think there will be a semi-permanent shift to digital shopping right now. I think many, my parents, my friends' parents have shopped online for groceries for probably the first time ever, right? And I think that's incredible in and of itself. And I think that's definitely, there's going to be some stickiness there because for many of these guys, they had their fears, they had their concerns, their doubts about what is the level of experience that I can get when shopping online, and now that that's been changed, then I think we're going to see a significant shift towards that. So yeah, I think this is one of some of the positives that we will witness post COVID.
And here's another really, really brilliant question. What is the best way to deal with customers that are used to cash on delivery for years rather than just switching off COD option?
So one option is obviously use Tabby, and so that's my plug for the day, where we're providing that alternative to these customers that just don't want to try it. But aside from that, honestly, I think when you look at customers and the reason they choose COD is it's not for a lack of credit cards and debit cards. I think most customers that are shopping online today in the market have access to credit cards and debit cards. I think, unfortunately, they've just had very poor experiences with their online shopping. Their orders didn't get there on time. Their orders were not fulfilled in many cases. I think that's a bigger problem that needs to be solved, where just consumer belief in e-commerce as a solution needs to be strengthened, and the experience needs to improve significantly before people start to trust that as to a larger extent as a mode of buying their things. So yeah, I think the experience is one part of it. Having said that, if I look at what we did at Namshi, our initial hypothesis was a customer will shop with us once or twice on COD and then shift to credit card and debit card. And over a 7.5-year period, while that did happen, that happened extremely slowly. And we moved from about an 85% COD to a 75% COD in a 7.5-year stretch. So while that hypothesis makes sense, customers might start to trust us, and with a better experience, they'll shift to digital payments. That didn't really manifest itself in reality.
So, Hosam, we've got so many questions. Okay, do you think single category e-commerce startups will become the trend in the region?
So I think what single category presents is differentiation and just an ability to own a category and be the leader in that category. So I think I prefer that model. I think you can only have so many or a few horizontal players in the market. I don't think you can have too many of those because those with the deepest pockets are going to win. So own a category and own a category very, very well, and you'll create a moat in and of itself. Right? So if I look at Namshi and what allowed us to really grow and develop in our sector was the fact that we owned a few categories extremely well. We did sports very well, and that just became our category. Whenever people bought sports, whenever people wanted to buy sports products, they came to Namshi. There weren't many players that were as broad and strong in that category. We owned back to school, and that just became the place to go for back to school. I think if you can start to create these differentiators in terms of category mix, then that probably goes a long way. One thing that we haven't seen in this market, and I think that's the only form of fashion e-commerce that or one of the best models for fashion e-commerce in other markets, say the UK and the US, is these private label brands that just build a brand on their own and sell that brand, right? So if you look at in the UK, you have Pretty Little Thing and Boohoo and a few of these. In the US, there's a few more private labels that have just really built a strong brand for themselves and grown despite the fact that you've had bigger players doing multi-brand against them. But that's been the differentiation. I think that's not something that we saw, that we've seen at all in this part of the world, and it's probably missing.
Right. So has Tabby tightened lending requirements since the onslaught of COVID-19?
So I think yes. So we're going to be a lot more careful about how we lend. Obviously, there's going to be more demand for our product as this situation unfolds. Given that people are going to be there's just going to be a lot more tighter spending with consumers. But at the same time, obviously, we predict a lot more defaults. So we need to obviously be a lot more careful with how we lend and who we lend to. Yes.
Okay. Can discounts act as an incentive to drive people more towards credit cards and digital forms of payment as a way to move them away from cash on delivery as an incentive?
We tried everything, right? And we tried all these things. And the problem with discounts is that they're very, very difficult to turn off, right? And so there are two ways of trying to switch people away from COD. You can either disincentivize them with a cost on COD or incentivize them with a discount elsewhere. And the incentives with discounts didn't work very well, because as soon as you switch those discounts off, people moved back to COD. And then when you so what we ended up doing is try to disincentivize with a cost on COD, but at the end of the day, it really didn't change. And we go back to what is the fundamental problem that people are trying to solve for by choosing COD, and that is, I want to make sure that I get my product on time, and I want to make sure that I get a product of the quality that I expect. And unless the e-commerce ecosystem as a whole solves for these two problems, I think we're going to probably be stuck with COD for some time, unless it's forced by external forces where it's switched off for everyone.
So I'm going to bring two questions into one, because we've got two Q&As in the audience about logistics. So one is kind of, with all the players in the logistics space here in the UAE, do you consider this an oversaturated market? And then another question, which is a little bit cheekier, is why is the experience still subpar?
Sure. So why is the experience still subpar? I'll leave that to the logistics players to answer. I think and specifically we're talking about last mile, right? And last mile, moreover with COD. So I think there's some processes that are broken, and some incentives are in play over here, where I get paid as a logistics player whether I deliver this order, this COD order or not. I think that probably has some part to play with that. Is there an oversaturation in the market with regards to logistics players? I think I don't think there's an oversaturation of good logistics players. So until we get to that point where there is a great last mile delivery service in the region that addresses the demands of the consumers, I think it's good to kind of try to solve for that problem. The problem is, this is a very expensive problem to solve for, and as such, I'm not sure how that will play out. Right. So we saw a number of logistics players come into the market, and rather than focusing on experience, the focus was on cost in order to grab market share. So again, we're not really solving the key fundamental problem breaking e-commerce in this region just yet, which then forces companies like Namshi and Noon and a few others to build their own last miles, rather than focusing on more fundamental core issues to their business.
Right. Sorry, I'm just sifting through quite a few questions. Okay, is your long-term strategy to go public like Afterpay, or are you seeking someone acquiring you like Afterpay and many other players in the global playing field? So that's a question about your strategy, sort of as Tabby.
Very early days, right? So we literally launched only a couple of months ago. So I think our strategy right now is really to grow across geographies. Maybe one of the challenges that we all face together as being within the region is that in order to grow and in order to scale, you need to go across geographies. You can't just there are a few examples, obviously, where the scale is big enough in one country, but for the most part, specifically on the e-commerce side, you need to grow across geographies, right? And so if you look at Afterpay, and back to our example on Tabby and Afterpay was able to grow quite substantially in Australia alone. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the same over here. We have very small and fragmented markets, and as such, the play needs to be cross-border and multiple geography in order to scale.
Right, and here's another Tabby question: is with everything moving online now beyond products, would Tabby consider payments beyond the product domain, so schools, health, etc.?
Yeah, so actually we're looking at a number of very interesting sectors right now beyond just pure e-commerce. Without giving away too much, we're looking at insurance, we're looking at services, travel. There's a few very interesting sectors that either are interesting right now or will become a bit more interesting as things unfold. But yeah, I think given as well the size of the market and where things are today, retail on its own might not be sufficient enough for scale in the current times.
Right, and here's a question about the market really and what it's ready for. So is there room for other formats and experiences in e-commerce? So think Etsy.com, Fancy.com, the long tail approach targeting specific segments. Can we expect to start seeing those in the region now?
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot more that hasn't been done. I think it's very clear what has been done, and there's been a lot of that. But there are, and I think that's related to the point I mentioned about private label, right? Private label hasn't really been touched in this market, and people haven't built their own products to sell to consumers. So along the lines of Etsy and just a differentiated assortment has not been done in the market successfully to scale just yet. So there's definitely room.
Right, and here's a question from Philip. Should startups be afraid of large corporates moving online to capture the e-commerce space?
I think if the startups and the corporates play it right, I think there should be a lot more room for collaboration, right? This is the time to do that. So they shouldn't be worried. I think a lot of corporates what they'll have is muscle and funding, but what they won't have is just the ability to move fast. And so there is a clear opportunity for a lot more startups to work with these corporates right now, and I think vice versa. The corporates need to be looking out for which startups they see value in. So now is a great time for consolidation. I don't know how many times I've said it today, but I don't think this is the time for everyone to build their own thing all over again. We built this enough times in the region, and now is the time to work together and then figure out who can do what well. To be honest, we've already started to see that change in Tabby. So we have a few banks that have approached us. the previous, if you look maybe 5-6 years from now ago, all these banks probably would have said, yeah, we can do this on our own and we can do our own thing. But now they're a lot more collaborative and they want to work with us. And similarly, with regards to some of the larger groups, they've approached us. They want to work and see how we can benefit them and how we can benefit from them as well. So I think, we're definitely starting to see that shift, which is great to see.
One final question about an industry that is very closely tied to e-commerce, which you're in now, is what beyond obviously buy now, pay later, what is the opportunity presented to FinTech as an industry right now as a result of COVID-19?
What do you mean? Maybe
so now we are more able in times of COVID-19 to adopt financial technologies that historically we haven't really been very rapid to adopt. So beyond what you're doing at Tabby, which is buy now, pay later, is where do you think the opportunities in FinTech are?
Sure, I think the payments space as a whole needs disrupting. We probably have one of the highest acquiring costs in the world for credit cards and debit cards, and that needs to change. Right, I had a call from a friend of mine today who owns a roastery, right, and a roastery where he roasts his own coffee and sells online, and unfortunately, his costs of acquiring are through the roof, and there's absolutely no excuse for that. The banks need to be a lot more. They need to understand that times are changing. I think also we're starting to see some changes there. I'm hoping they're not short term, but payments as a whole needs to see significant disruption in this part of the world, and it would be great to see the Stripes of the world and similar types of payments processes and tools coming to the market and change how we've traditionally done things.
And as an e-commerce veteran now, and this really is the last question, I promise. I just keep getting such good questions. What aspects of an e-commerce business should a startup look to focus on? Are we looking at marketing, logistics, photography, etc., to ensure that the money is being spent on the right thing? Now we have to think, obviously, we have to prioritize.
Sure. So I think one thing I didn't mention, and I probably should have mentioned, is hiring the right talent early on. And maybe that sounds very cliche, but honestly, I think that's one thing that's really, really differentiated us at Namshi is we hired people that gave a shit, right? Our employees all really cared deeply about the business. And I think that went a very long way. And everyone just put their heart into the business. They shared the mission, they shared the goals that we had. They saw the common kind of underdog that we were within the overall the broader ecosystem. And I think we went a very, very long way because of that. So I think the hiring is hiring the right talent that cares deeply about your mission, about your business is key. And I don't want to understate that, and I don't want that to sound as a cliche. I think that's very important. But where do you invest? I think choose your battles, right? There's way too much to do. Invest in high impact products and projects for the business. If you invested in every small feature and tool that you could that you get bombarded with every day, then you end up not doing anything very well, right? So I think one of the things that we did extremely well is just focus on what was important for our customers. And I would say there are two things there. One was experience, again, ensure that what we are offering our customers is top-notch experience, where if we acquire them, we're not going to lose that investment on that acquisition. And then the second part that we invested very heavily in is assortment, right? We wanted to ensure that we had the right assortment for our customers. And our secret to growth, if you will, was growing our assortment. We grew, our growth really mirrored how our assortment grew online. And I'm not just talking about any assortment. You can't just have a dump of marketplace products that's available. You want to grow your assortment in a very smart way that suits what your customer is looking for, and grow accordingly. So, I think there's a lot of shiny tools and shiny objects that you can invest in, but what is the core of your offering? I think we sold fashion, and therefore we needed to get that product right, and we sold experience. We sold convenience. If we got those two things right, then a lot of other things fell into place. What we see a lot of businesses overinvest in these days is probably tech. I think there's a lot of simple, cheap, easy solutions out there that can get started and start selling, and you can upgrade your tech and invest in Salesforce later.
So Hosam, I want you to know that we've got about 35 more questions. So I don't think we'll be able to answer any of them, as we're already a little bit over time. We try and keep these under 45 minutes. But I think testament to how engaged people are in e-commerce. So I really want to say thank you on behalf of everybody that attended this. Thank you for joining us, Hosam.
Thanks, guys, for the questions.
And if anybody is interested in learning a little bit more about e-commerce, we at MAGNiTT have an e-commerce report, and we'll be offering a 25% discount to everybody who was on this webinar, and I'll be sending this in a follow-up email. And I know there are quite a few questions that we didn't answer, but I will try and get those to Hosam to see which ones he's able to answer. Thank you very much for your time. And yes, we will be recording this as we record all of the MAGNiTT webinars and uploading it as well. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with somebody else, you can do that. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.